The first thing they tried to steal from me wasn't money, it was reality. I came up to my own gate one cold morning and found a notice tape there like some cheap little death certificate. Bold letters, official stamps, the whole performance, telling me the road my family had driven for 3 generations no longer belonged to us. And standing down by the entrance, measuring and scribbling like vultures in polo shirts, were HOA inspectors already acting like the land had changed hands while I was out feeding cattle. I just sat there in my truck for a second with both hands on the wheel, staring at that paper like if I looked hard enough it might get embarrassed and blow away. That road wasn't some strip of gravel to me. My granddad laid those stones by hand. My father hauled cattle down it every summer. I learned to ride on that road, learned to cuss on that road, learned what tired felt like on that road. Every bend in it was part of my life. So when I read the line saying the HOA now claimed jurisdiction over it and that I owed 7 years of retroactive dues, I felt something go hot and heavy in my chest. I said it out loud, though there was nobody there to hear it except a few cows and probably the Lord. They can't just take what's mine. My name's Jake Calloway, and I'm not the kind of man who goes looking for a fight. I get up before sunrise, feed stock, mend fence, check water lines, fix what's broken, and go to bed sore in the honest kind of way. This ranch is my work, my family's history, and the closest thing I have to a religion. We'd had little run-ins with the HOA before noise complaints, boundary whining, suburban folks moving next to ranch land, and then acting stunned that ranches come with smells and dust and livestock. But it had always been petty stuff. Annoying, not dangerous. This was dangerous. The next morning, I drove back to the gate for answers, and there was Richard Harland already waiting like a man posing for a campaign photo. Richard was in his mid-50s, silver hair, pressed shirt, expensive boots that had never seen a real muddy field in their lives. He had that polished smile some men wear when they've spent years mistaking intimidation for leadership. "Mr. Calloway," he said, holding out a hand. I looked at it, then looked back at him. "What is this?" He folded his hands like he was about to explain taxes to a child. Said the association had conducted a review of regional access easements, said their records showed the road fell under HOA jurisdiction, said dues applied retroactively, said all of it with this calm, buttery politeness that made me want to put my fist through his laminated folder. "My grandfather built this road," I told him. "It's on my deed. Your HOA didn't even exist when that road was laid." He pulled out a survey map highlighted in yellow like a kindergarten project. On that map, somehow my road had become a shared easement. The problem was even at a glance the thing was wrong. The curve of the road bent the wrong direction. The scale looked off. The boundary line cut across terrain that made no sense if you'd ever stood on the land with your own 2 boots. "The road goes west right there," I said, pointing. "Your map says east." Our surveyor reviewed it thoroughly, he said. "Minor discrepancies don't change legal standing." I laughed. Then not because it was funny, but because sometimes the human mind refuses to process stupidity any other way. "You're calling geography a discrepancy." His smile tightened. Then came the threat still delivered in that syrupy tone, 30 days to pay, or the HOA would restrict non-resident access to the road and begin legal action. "You'd block access to my ranch. We'd be enforcing policy." "Nothing personal," he said. That's always how men like Richard Harland talk, right before they try to put their hand in your pocket and their boot on your neck. Nothing personal. That night, I spread every document I owned across my kitchen table. Deeds, surveys, tax filings, maintenance receipts, old folders with my father's handwriting on them, papers yellowed at the edges from years in storage. I sat there under that buzzing overhead light until past midnight, tracing boundary lines with my finger, cross-checking dates, looking for anything I'd missed all these years simply because I'd never imagined I'd need to defend what had always been obvious. And there it was, plain as daylight. My deed described the road clearly as private property maintained by the Calloway family, not subject to any shared easement, not within HOA boundaries, not even close. The old survey matched the actual land exactly right down to the curve west at the north edge. Richard's map didn't just conflict with it. Richard's map looked invented. 3 days later, the letters started coming. First, a formal demand for dues, itemized by year, with late fees stacked on top like somebody was building a bonfire out of paper. Then a second letter from some law firm I'd never heard of, warning that failure to comply could result in a lien against the property. A lien on my family's ranch, over a road built by my grandfather. I carried that letter outside and stood at the gate in the late afternoon light while cattle grazed in the far field and a hawk circled above the trees. Everything looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel the same. That's the thing about trouble. Sometimes it doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet change in the air, and all at once the place you've always felt safest starts to feel like the opening scene of a storm. That evening, my daughter called from college. She was studying pre-law, which still amused me because she got that sharp mind from her mother, not me. I told her what was happening, and she got real quiet for a second, then said, "Dad, they can't just create an easement out of thin air. Not legally. But you need proof, everything. Photos, maintenance records, witnesses, all of it." So I started building a wall out of facts. I photographed the gate, the old Callaway Ranch sign, the private property markers my father installed years ago, the cattle grid at the entrance, every inch of that road. I dug up receipts for gravel deliveries, grading work, drainage repairs, 15 years of paying for that road out of my own pocket. I called neighbors who'd been around long enough to remember before the HOA ever showed up in this county. Earl Hutchkins didn't hesitate. "That road was always yours, Jake. Everybody knew it." Margaret O'Neill said the same thing. "If we ever use that road, we ask permission first. Your daddy made sure of that." Then Richard escalated. One afternoon, I came home from town and found orange cones blocking part of the entrance and a laminated sign zip-tied between them that read, "Notice HO, a managed access subject to association approval." I stared at it for 10 full seconds, then took photos from every angle, date-stamped, location-tagged, clean and neat. After that, I pulled the sign and cones aside and drove through. Didn't tear them up, didn't toss them in a ditch, didn't give anybody the satisfaction of calling me unstable. I was too angry for sloppy. That night I called Thomas Greaves, the lawyer who handled my father's estate. Thomas is one of those men who never wastes a word, which means when he does say something, you tend to listen. Send me everything he said. After he reviewed it all, he called back and said, "I think someone made a very bold move, assuming you wouldn't push back." That was as close to outrage as Thomas ever got. Inside a week, Richard took things public. He had read no trespassing signs, hammered along both sides of my road every 50 yards like he was planting flags on conquered territory. Then an HOA truck started intercepting delivery drivers at my entrance, telling them they needed authorization to use the road. After that, he held a community meeting and told the neighborhood I'd been using HOA, maintained infrastructure for years without contributing. Gave a whole little presentation, apparently. PowerPoint and lies, the modern tools of tyranny. What he was doing became obvious. This wasn't a records dispute. This was a campaign. Paper pressure, public pressure, physical presence, financial threats, all designed to make me feel isolated enough to cave. But that plan of his had a weakness, and it showed up in work boots and pickup trucks. Earl called and said he'd tell anybody who asked that the road was mine. Margaret texted to say her written statement was ready. Darnell Cooper, who'd seen the HOA truck blocking a delivery, stopped by and said, "Those men had no business on your land." I'll say that to anybody. And then Thomas found the twist that cracked the whole thing open. He called me into his office one Thursday and had county records spread all over his conference table. Original HOA formation documents, amended boundary filings, correspondence with a private surveying firm, the whole mess. The map Harlan showed you, he said tapping the page, was filed 18 months ago. I looked at him. The HOA's been there 22 years. Exactly. The original HOA map did not include my road. Not even close. 18 months ago, somebody had filed an amended map expanding the HOA's jurisdiction to include several road segments, mine among them. The amendment was signed by Richard Harlan, the HOA treasurer Vincent Pruitt, and notarized by a woman named Carol Ames. There was just one problem. Thomas had called Carol Ames. She had no record of notarizing that document. No entry in her log. No matching document number. No memory of it. Nothing. I sat there staring at that page, feeling the anger in me change shape. Up to that point, I'd been fighting off a land grab. Now I was looking at what smelled an awful lot like fraud. It got uglier from there. Thomas dug into Vincent Pruitt and found he'd been tied to 2 other HOA boundary disputes in the county, both settled quietly before hearings ever got far enough to examine the paperwork closely. I tracked down one of those property owners, a retired school teacher named Howard Bell. He told me they'd pressured him with legal bills and official-looking maps until paying felt easier than resisting. "I always thought something was wrong," he said. "I just didn't know how to prove it." That sentence stayed with me because that's how people like Richard win. Not by being right, by making it too exhausting for decent people to keep fighting. The community meeting came 2 weeks later at the Pinecrest Community Center, one of those squat brick buildings with fluorescent lights that make everybody look vaguely guilty. The parking lot was packed. Richard sat at the front beside Vincent, and the board calm as a man who still believed he could talk his way out of gravity. Thomas had given me one instruction: let them speak first, then present the truth like a ledger. So I did. Richard framed the whole thing as an unfortunate compliance issue involving one uncooperative property owner. He projected that same yellow map on the screen and spoke in that warm, reasonable tone men use when they want the room to mistake confidence for honesty. When he opened the floor, I stood up and walked to the front carrying my folder. I asked one question first. Can anybody here tell me when this HOA was founded? Somebody said 22 years. I held up the original formation documents. Then maybe somebody can explain why this road doesn't appear anywhere on the original jurisdiction map. A woman from the third row came forward to compare the documents. Her face changed almost instantly. These maps are different, she said. That's right, I said. My road was added 18 months ago. Then I held up Carol Ames's statement. The notary whose stamp appears on this amendment has no record of ever signing it. You could feel the room shift. Not dramatically, not like in a movie. More like a floorboard cracking beneath a heavy piece of furniture. One of the board members, Diane Cho, looked straight at Richard and asked, "Is that true?" Richard started talking about complexities and paperwork irregularities and administrative procedure, and that's when Thomas spoke from the back, calm as winter. A forged notary stamp is not a paperwork irregularity. After that, the whole performance started collapsing under its own weight. 3 weeks later, we had the formal hearing. Richard showed up with his lawyer. Vincent Pruitt, suddenly brave enough to vanish, had resigned from the board 2 days earlier. Thomas built the case piece by piece: the original map, the fake amendment, Carol Ames's testimony, 15 years of maintenance receipts, witness statements from Earl and Margaret Howard Bell's story showing the pattern. Carol Ames was magnificent. Fitch, Richard's lawyer, tried to suggest she might have missed an entry in her logbook. She looked at him over her glasses and said, "I've notarized over 4,000 documents in this county. I have never missed a log entry, not once." That woman put more fear in that room than any shouting ever could. When the judge finally asked Richard whether he had been present when the amendment was notarized, he started fumbling around with words like administrative office and filing process and arranged separately. You ever see a man realize in real time that the polished version of himself he's been selling people has just expired? It looked like that. The panel recessed, then they came back. Judge Patricia Voss invalidated the amendment on the spot, said the evidence strongly suggested fraudulent notarization, and referred the matter to the county attorney for investigation. Every claim due, every late fee, every fake surcharge tied to my road was nullified. The HOA's claim to jurisdiction was denied in its entirety. The road remained what it had always been: private property of the Callaway family. Richard just sat there staring at the table. Didn't look at me once. That was the sweetest part, if I'm being honest. Not even the ruling, though, that mattered. It was watching a man who'd spent years weaponizing confidence suddenly run out of room to stand in. Within 11 days, Richard resigned as HOA president. No big farewell, no praise, no noble excuse. He just disappeared from the position like mold after bleach. The county opened a formal investigation. Vincent got interviewed too. Diane and the remaining board members began reviewing older filings to see what else had been tampered with. And me, I drove home on my road. The red HOA signs were gone. The gate stood where it always had. The hills were turning gold in the late light, cattle off in the distance, wind moving soft through the grass. I got out and stood there for a minute just listening. Same road, same ranch, same sky, but the silence felt different now. Lighter. Earned. What I learned from all this wasn't something tidy and inspirational you slap on a coffee mug. It was rougher than that. The truth is, rights mean very little if you don't know how to prove them. Family history matters, but paperwork matters too. Memory matters, but records matter more in a room full of officials and liars. And kindness, real kindness, doesn't mean letting people steamroll you to keep the peace. Sometimes the most decent thing you can do is refuse to surrender what was never theirs in the first place. My grandfather built that road because it needed building. My father kept it because it was his duty. I fought for it because one ugly little piece of paper taught me how fast greed will call itself procedure if nobody stands up and says no. So now I want to ask you something. When people in power use rules, paperwork, and polished language to steal from ordinary folks, is fighting back justice? Or is it just revenge wearing better manners? Tell me what you think in the comments, who was right, who was wrong, and what you would have done if somebody tried to take your land, your home, or your family's history with a fake map and a smile. And if you've ever lived through your own version of this kind of fight, share that too, because stories like this remind people they're not crazy and they're not alone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got cattle to feed and a road to drive. It's mine.